Hi, my name is Wendy Strobel-Gower, and I'm here today to talk about the employment of people with physical disabilities. Specifically, we're going to talk about some of the legislation that can impact people with physical disabilities as they search for work. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do an overview of Title I of the ADA. We're going to talk about Sections 501 and Sections 503 of the Rehab Act. And then we're also going to talk about some decision points for job seekers as they seek to gain employment. The first thing we're going to talk about is the ADA and its amendments. And just as a point of understanding as we begin, the ADA is a civil rights law. It was patterned after the Rehab Act and really laid out the right of people with disabilities to participate fully in society. Unfortunately, before this law was passed, that wasn't always the case. So there's 5 titles of the ADA. Title I deals with employment. That's what we're going to talk about today. But I wanted to let you know that there are other provisions in the ADA that protect people with disabilities and lay out the obligations for different entities. So Title II deals with access to state and local governments. So that means your right to vote, your right to be able to get to court, all the things, your municipal services that you should have access to. Title III deals with places of public accommodations, things like hotels, restaurants, public spaces, that they should be accessible to people with disabilities. Title IV deals with telecommunications. It established the relay services that assist people who are deaf to communicate on the phone. And Title V are the miscellaneous provisions. It deals with things like financial, so basically it lays out limits for financial reward if you sue somebody. It also deals with things like retaliation, things like that. So it just basically lays out some of the finer points of the law. So the next thing we're going to talk about is Title I. Title I is an anti-discrimination law that's enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. It removes barriers to equal employment opportunities for people with disabilities. Access in Title I is entirely based on merit. There's no quotas, there's no affirmative action requirements. For Title I of the ADA to apply to you, you have to have a qualifying disability and you have to be qualified for a job. And we're going to talk about both of those things in a little bit. The ADA was signed into law by George H.W. Bush, on July 26, 1990. We recently had the 25th anniversary. I think now we're approaching the 27th. But really, at its essence, the ADA is an equal opportunity law for people with disabilities. So it really is meant to say that discrimination against people with disabilities solely because they have a disability is not okay. It's not something that we support. Okay. Discrimination under Title I is prohibited at every phase of the employment process. That means when you apply for the job, when you get hired, when you're being fired, as you seek advancement in the job, when you're looking at equal pay issues around compensation, for job training opportunities, and other terms, conditions, and privileges of employment. And we're going to go into these a little more deeply. But basically, any adverse action that happens solely because of a disability is discrimination in any of these phases of employment. And while many people are aware of how the discrimination, how people can be discriminated against as they seek to get fired or as they are already employed, they fail to realize that they also have protections during that job application process, that the job application process should be accessible, that if they need an accommodation during that interview process, they should be able to ask for it and receive it and still not lose opportunities to be hired in the job. So as we discussed earlier, the people who the law protects are qualified individuals with disabilities. And qualified is different for each job that you might apply for. So in one case, you might be perfectly qualified for a job because you have the skills and experience and education that's necessary for it. And another, you might not be qualified because you don't have the requisite skills and experience necessary to perform the job. And that's really a critical point, that it's a case-by-case basis. The ADA is very often, you'll hear it depends, when you're looking at whether or not you're protected by the ADA in a certain circumstance, because there are so many individualized factors that are critical to consider. And the first is whether or not you have the skills and experience that the employer requires to do a job. And that determines whether or not you're qualified. You have to be able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodation. During an interview, that question, can you perform the essential functions of the job with or without an accommodation, is a yes or no question. It's not a tell me how, it's a yes or no question. And then finally, to be protected under the ADA, you have to have a disability as defined by the law. With the Amendments Act, what the court said was, and what Congress said, is that disability was to be construed broadly in favor of expansive coverage to the maximum extent permitted by the terms of the ADA. So what we're seeing now since the Amendments Act passed is that a lot more people are covered by the ADA than they were pre-Amendments Act. The ADA Amendments Act was signed into law on September 25th, 2008. It took effect on January 1st, 2009. The Amendments Act kept the original definition of the ADA, which is the three-pronged definition that you hear about, that we'll discuss in just a minute. And basically what they said was people are being discriminated against, and no one is considering whether or not they have been discriminated against. What they're looking at is, does the person have a disability? And the focus was so intently on whether or not the person had a disability that no one was looking at the actions of the employer and asking, was discrimination occurring? So the ADA Amendments Act was passed to really limit the actions of the employer, or to look at the actions of the employer rather than whether or not the person had a qualifying disability. So basically, the EEOC was told, let's start looking at what the company's doing that might be discriminatory against people with disabilities. So really, since the definition did not change, and let me tell you what the definition is. A person with a disability under the ADA is an individual who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of his major life activities, has a record of such an impairment, or is regarded as having such an impairment. And that definition has remained constant. Let me just explain briefly. If someone has a record of an impairment, it may be that they wore leg braces when they were younger or in high school, and then they graduated out of those leg braces, but someone knew in the past that they had used them before. And so they have a record of having a disability, and because of that, someone takes an adverse employment action against them. And then for regarded as having such an impairment, it could be that you walk with a limp, and it doesn't really affect your functioning, it doesn't affect your performance, it's not going to get any worse or any better no matter what you do, but people look at you and they think you have a disability because of the way that you walk. So they treat you like you have a disability even though it really does not impair your function at all. So that would be regarded as having such an impairment. What changed here when the ADA Amendments Act was passed was the rules of construction. And we're going to go through what those are in just a minute. So basically, when the ADA Amendments Act was passed, Congress lowered the bar on disability inquiry. They said, stop asking so many questions. You're looking too much at the person's disability and whether or not you think they have one, and not looking at what it is you're doing wrong. So they said very clearly, that's what our focus is going to be. Have you complied with your obligations under the ADA? And they said disability should not demand extensive analysis. So again, stop looking so closely at disability and start thinking about, did the company do what they said they were going to do? So the first thing that the ADA Amendments Act did, major life activities have always been part of an ADA, and you might have heard of these. Can you care for yourself? Can you perform manual tasks? Are you able to see, hear, eat, sleep, walk, stand, sit? All the major life activities that make up people's daily lives. What the ADA Amendments Act added were major bodily functions So they added functions of the immune system, special sense organs, and skin. They added normal cell growth to cover people who have cancer. They added digestive issues. They added neurological function, brain function, respiratory function, circulatory function, cardiovascular function, endocrine function. So all of the things to capture the major medical illnesses that might impact someone. So diabetes is clearly covered under major bodily functions. Cancer is clearly covered under major bodily functions. HIV and AIDS is covered under major bodily functions. So they added that category to say, okay, so the person isn't impacted in how they care for themselves, but clearly their immune system does not function correctly. So they're covered under the ADA. So you see where Congress attempted to be very clear to say, quit looking at disability. These things are all covered. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is mitigating measures. So mitigating measures are things that people do to lessen the impact of their disability in their daily life. And it could be things like medication. For example, insulin, if you have diabetes, is a mitigating measure. Maybe you use low vision devices or hearing aids or mobility aids, such as a scooter or a wheelchair, to make it easier for you to walk in or get around in your daily life. They might be things like assistive technology, reasonable accommodations, and then just things that you've learned to do over time to adapt the way that you interact with the world. So before the ADA Amendments Act was passed, if you had a mitigating measure that you used to lessen the impact of your disability in your daily life, the court said then you did not have a disability. So regardless of how you get in the door at work in the morning, if you use a scooter to come into the work because you can't walk long distance, that doesn't make your disability go away. You still have whatever disability it was that you started the day with, but you're just using something to make your life easier as you go through the world. So they were very clear and said mitigating measures should no longer be considered in determining disability. And the courts have supported this as they've made decisions since the ADA Amendments Act was passed that indeed mitigating measures have not been considered in deciding whether or not someone had a disability. So the second thing that they said is if you have an episodic condition, a condition that comes and goes, and sometimes it's worse and sometimes it's better. So what they said was if a condition would be classified as a disability when it's in its active state, then it's a disability. And when you think about this, think about things like cancer or MS or things that sometimes flare or can be significant in your life and sometimes go into remission, or you have a period where you're not actively sick. So it's very important for episodic conditions that you do the things that keep you healthy. So let's say you have MS and you have to be sensitive to stress, you have to be sensitive to heat, you have to be sensitive to fatigue issues. So if you have a job that required you to do a swing shift, you might say, I can't do the swing shift. If it's not an essential function of the job, that's something that should be accommodated. Because if you don't take care of yourself in that way, then you will get actively sick. And at which point they would probably say you were no longer qualified for your job pre-ADA Amendments Act. And so that's why that particular rule of construction is really a critical one. So let's look a little bit more at reasonable accommodation, because it's a really important part of the ADA and the protections that it affords. A reasonable accommodation is any change in the work environment or in the way things are customarily done that enables an individual to enjoy, with a disability, to enjoy equal employment opportunities. And we're going to talk about those in just a minute. So equal employment opportunities are, it's the opportunity to attain the same level of performance or to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment. And this definition is a little bit like an onion, so bear with me, there's layers. So the same level of performance really says that if you need to do something differently on your job to get the same work done, and that's what's really critical when you're looking at reasonable accommodation, it's the work that's important, not how you go about doing the work. So just as an example, let's say that you have part of your job responsibilities are to go out into the community and do site visits. And the assumption has always been that the person in that position would drive to those appointments. But driving isn't really something that's essential. Being able to go to the different sites is what's the essential function. So if they take the bus, if they use public transportation like taxis, if they have a driver, they're able to transport themselves around the community and get the work done. They just aren't driving themselves. So you have to look really closely at what is essential. It's not the act of driving, but rather the act of moving about the community. And then equal benefits and privileges of employment are things like if your employer provides a gym, that gym has to be accessible to you. If you're going to go to meetings that the company holds or training opportunities that the company holds, those have to be accessible to you. So it's really all of the aspects of employment that everyone else in the job can take advantage of. You have to be able to take advantage of those as well. And I know these are slightly confusing terms. So should you ever have a question, the ADA National Network has an 800 number you can call and kind of talk through all of the elements of reasonable accommodation, of what that definition means. And as I said, often the answer in the ADA is it depends, because it is so individual. So having someone to be able to talk through those situations that you find yourself in can be really critical. At the end, I'm going to give you that number so that you'll have it. So basically, there's three categories of accommodations. The first is in the application process. Remember, I said at the beginning that the company has to make it possible for you to submit your application to be hired with them. So you have to be able to fill out an application. You have to be able to get to the interview and communicate with people in that interview. Often we're seeing this translate into wanting the application process to be accessible online. And the ADA is a little bit ambiguous around online applications. But more and more the courts are finding that it should be, the web should be accessible to people with disabilities. If it's not, the company has to take other approaches to ensuring that you can apply. So if their website's not accessible and you have to submit your application that way, you have to be able to call someone at the company to do your application with them. You have to be able to fill out a paper application, and it's given the same consideration. You also have to be able to perform the essential functions of the position. So that's where people have to accommodate you as you do the work. And then the final one is enjoying the equal benefits and privileges of employment. That's what we just talked about, making sure that the entirety of the job is accessible to you. So let's talk about what's reasonable in terms of accommodation. Okay, modifications to increase facility accessibility. So if, let's say that you work in a retail store, widening the space between the racks of clothing or racks of merchandise might be a modification that a company would do. Job restructuring, so taking away non-essential job functions, marginal job functions is what they're called, and assigning them to another employee. Flexible scheduling, so allowing you to come in at 10 o'clock and leave at 4 o'clock. Acquiring new equipment, such as a reacher or a machine that helps with the manual aspects of the task, like an electric stapler, something to help with the physical requirements of a job. Providing qualified readers and interpreters is a reasonable accommodation, and also modification of application and testing procedures or training materials. So if you have to go into training for your new job and you require something to be captioned, the company has a responsibility to make sure that it's captioned for you, or that you can have a qualified reader or some other way to get access to that information. And again, remember that in considering whether accommodation is reasonable or not, it depends on the essential functions of the job and the work environment that you're in, and also how your disability impacts your functional limitations. So it is a case-by-case basis every single time. So what's clearly reasonable in one situation, such as allowing someone to work from home, may not be reasonable in other situations where presence is required on the job, that you have to be in that office space. So it really is on a case-by-case basis. And then some things that are generally not considered to be reasonable accommodations. Eliminating essential job functions. Employers are never required to eliminate essential job functions. Hopefully they've done the analysis to determine what really is essential and what really is marginal. Lowering production standards applied to all employees. Companies are allowed to set production standards. They should have those so that you have a goal of what you're working towards. They don't have to lower those production standards because someone has a disability that impacts their rate of work. They have to allow you to do the work in a different way, but they don't have to take away that performance standard. They don't have to provide personal use items, things like hearing aids, scooters, crutches, things like that. They don't have to change your supervisor. So you may have a supervisor that you are not getting along with, that you feel like exacerbates your condition or won't work with you. The employer is never required to change that supervisor as a reasonable accommodation to you. They may ask the supervisor to change the way that they interact with you, but they don't have to make that person go away. And then they don't have to excuse any violations of uniformly applied conduct standards. So companies have rules for reasons. The ADA fully recognizes employers' right to do that. So let's say that there is an absolutely zero tolerance policy for hitting a coworker, and you hit a coworker, and then you're fired, and there's no amount of anything you can do is going to change that. So it's an important consideration. When you're asking for an accommodation, the first step towards asking for an accommodation at work is letting your employer know you have a disability. And this is called disclosure. So there are some things that clearly would trigger an accommodation request and some things that don't. So if you say things like, I feel really tired today, I think my allergies are kicking in, I'm so stressed out, I think I need to take up meditation, I think I'm coming down with something, I feel so achy. None of those are really going to be considered disclosures. That's just complaining, right? It's what humans do. But here are some examples of disability disclosure, and it can be very subtle. I'm sorry I had to leave the meeting earlier. I had some problems with my insulin. I was late yesterday because my MS symptoms had kicked in. I was trying out a new medication and it made me groggy, and that's why my reports were a little late. So you see, it can be very subtle. It's because of X medical condition, I'm having trouble with Y job duty. Anytime you say that combination, then it's clearly a disability disclosure. And one important thing to know is that it's you or your representative can ask for an accommodation. Usually this little tenet of the ADA is reserved for when someone is unable to ask. So you're in the hospital and you can't call your employer and let them know that you need to take leave. But it can be used in other circumstances. So you could have a job coach or a family member request an accommodation on your behalf. But make sure that you're involved in that discussion. You know your needs best, and you want to have a seat at the table as they're discussing, what are your job duties, what's going to work for you, and what is the adjustment period going to look like for you. You want a seat at that table to be in that interactive process, and that's really critical. When you're asking for an accommodation, you don't have to use any special language. You don't have to declare anything about the ADA or another law that you might be protected under. You just have to say, because of X medical condition, I'm having trouble with Y. After that initial question, your employer may ask you to fill out a form, and they're purely within their rights to do that. And you have to participate in that interactive process. And let me explain that the interactive process is a two-way street. So you disclose your disability to employer. Your employer then has to act. Your employer gives you a form to fill out or to take to your doctor. You then have to get that form filled out and talk to your doctor. And then you have to have a conversation about what's going to work for you, what's going to work for the employer, to make sure that everyone's on the same page. And when the EEOC, if you filed a charge, when the EEOC came in, whoever dropped the ball in that interactive discussion is the one who's probably going to lose the case. So you have to make sure that you are doing your part. And I always tell both parties, document when you made the request, what happened next, how you responded to their request, so that you have that information should you ever have to file a charge. And it's also good to be able to go back to your employer and say, listen, I asked for an accommodation on X date and nothing changed, and now it's X date, and when is something going to happen? So that you can proactively pursue what it is you need to be your best at work. And I think that's an important thing to have on your side, so that you know that you've done your due diligence, and that clearly if nothing happened, then it's the employer who is being obstructive in that case. So the employer does have obligations as well during the interactive process. First, you have to engage in the interactive process. They have to have that conversation with you. They have to only accommodate known disabilities. If you feel like your disability is obvious, that they should be able to see it, and they don't do anything, they may not realize that you have a disability. So you may have to go that extra step to tell them. Remember, employers are trying very hard not to activate the assumptions of disability that can come up as we talked about the definition of disability under the law. So when you want accommodation at work and nothing's happening and you think it should be, let your employer know that you have a disability, that you are requesting an accommodation. Employers have a right to get limited documentation about your medical condition. They should not do this for an obvious disability. Some employer policy does, and it's okay. It's not optimal, but they certainly can. So let's say you come into work in a wheelchair and you say, I'm going to need a ramp to get in the building. And they say, can you have your doctor fill out a form? Be like, hello, I'm using a wheelchair and I can't get in the door. But they can still ask for that documentation. And then the employer makes the final decision as to what accommodation gets put into place. So you may think that you know the perfect solution, and you propose to them that they get you this, you know it's going to work, you know it's going to be the best thing. And they say, yeah, that's not going to work for us. We're going to give you this. And as long as that accommodation is effective, they're well within their rights to do that. So just as an example, there was a story that I heard from an employer who someone had a back injury and they purchased themselves a new chair and they brought it into work. And they said, this is my new chair. It really works for me. Here's the bill for that chair at $1,500. Can you please pay for it? And the employer said, no, we won't. And basically, it's not within the person with a disability, it's not their right to purchase that accommodation and demand payment for it from their employer. The employer gets to decide what gets put into place. There's a lot of times that employers will have outlets to get something at a lower cost. If they are tracking their accommodations, they have opportunities to save money. So they are the ones who get to decide that. And that accommodation, remember, it has to work for you. It has to be effective. So when they say to you, we're going to give you this, do your best to make it work. Get the training that's offered. Make sure that you try to do your work with it and work with them to do it. If it doesn't work for you, you have the option to then say, this is not effective for me. Can we do something else? Excuse me. But it's their right to make that decision as to what gets implemented. Okay. All right, we're going to talk about the Rehabilitation Act. We're going to specifically talk about sections 501 and 503. So the Rehab Act, again, is an anti-discrimination law, and it covers things like programs run by federal agencies, programs that receive federal financial assistance, federal employment, and then employment practices of federal contractors. And specifically today, we're going to talk about Section 501, which covers federal employment, and Sections 503, which covers employment and federal contractor agencies. So the new regulations for Section 501 just came out very recently. 501 applies to federal employers, so federal agencies, basically. Department of Forestry, Department of Education, Department of Justice, all of those. And basically, Section 501 is an affirmative action law to hire and advance in employment qualified individuals with disabilities. So the Rehab Act differs from the ADA because the ADA is not based on affirmative action. 501 and 503 are based on affirmative action. 501, again, protects applicants as well as employees. Complaints initially go to an EEO counselor at the agency where you work. So the complaints are initially handled internally before they move on to the EEOC if you can't come to a decision. And as I said, the new regulations just came out. So basically the new regulations align Section 501 to the ADA Amendments Act, to the definition of disability used in the ADA Amendments Act, and then to the rules of construction that we talked about earlier. It creates and implements affirmative action plans for hiring, placement, and advancement of people with disabilities. The federal agencies were given a goal of 12% people with disabilities in their workforce. 2% were supposed to have targeted disabilities, which includes things like developmental disabilities, which would include things like CP or autism spectrum disorder, TBI, deafness, blindness, missing extremities, significant mobility impairments, paralysis, epilepsy, things like that. So it requires also personal assistance services, which is something that's brand new in the law, because some people with targeted disabilities require them to work effectively. So those regs were released, and about a month later, the president issued a hiring freeze for the federal government. So we have yet to see what's going to happen with those regulations, because with the hiring freeze, there's no opportunity really for the law to move forward. So we'll have to wait and see how the implications are implemented once that hiring freeze is lifted. And then let's talk about Section 503. Section 503 covers prohibits discrimination by covered federal contractors and subcontractors against individuals on the basis of disabilities. Again, it's an affirmative action law. The threshold in 503 is 7% people with disabilities in the workforce, as opposed to 10%. Complaints for this law go to OFCCP. So this law was passed because the federal government is supposed to be a model employer for people with disabilities. And so they said, as should our federal contractors be. We know that legal compliance alone doesn't equal competitive advantage, and that disability inclusiveness does. So this law was a very clear mandate for companies who the government gives money to do their work, to be inclusive of people with disabilities. And I tell you, as someone who does work with employers pretty often, we did see an increased interest in building culture around disability and being inclusive of people with disabilities because of this law. So Section 503 covers all employers with federal contracts or subcontracts that are $10,000 or more. And you would really be surprised at how many companies are covered federal contractors. It's really, really difficult to find a list of these places. So I think one important question is to say, are you a federal contractor? Because then you know if they are interested, more interested maybe than other companies in working with people with disabilities. Right now, the government spends about $500 billion a year on federal contractors. And between 2000 and 2012, federal contracts increased by 87%. So again, this is no small potatoes. This is a pretty big swath of employers who are covered. So Section 503 has changes in two areas. The first are around those reasonable or affirmative action requirements. They have to collect data and do reporting around how many people they interview and how many people they hire who have disabilities. Again, that sets that aspirational goal of 7% people with disabilities and any work group within their employment. Okay, it sets a 7% goal for each class of jobs within a given employer. Disability has to be included in the EEO statement. They need statements from leadership that says they're committed to affirmative action and to hiring people with disabilities. And research tells us that that is critical, that buy-in from the top then tells managers that they're serious about hiring people with disabilities, and that's something that they really want them to do. They have to do that periodic review of the essential functions of the job and what are the qualifications for the job. They have to measure the effectiveness of their affirmative action program, And then they have to train their personnel around disability and how to build a disability inclusive workforce. It also implements the non-discrimination. It also has non-discrimination implications. So it implements the ADA Amendments Act in this law, and it also strongly recommends accessible IT. It does not require it, but it strongly recommends it. The other thing that 503 requires is job candidate outreach. It requires that contractors undertake appropriate outreach and positive recruitment activities to ensure that they have a pipeline of people with disabilities coming into their workforce. So you have to remember that the purpose of 503 is to employ and advance in employment. So if you get a job with the federal contractors, their job is not just to give you a job that you stay in for 20 years. It's to give you a job that allows you to move up in the ranks, to get promotion opportunities, to get training opportunities. And I think that's really a critical thing because too often placement for people with disabilities is just, oh yeah, they have this entry-level job and that's where they're going to be for the rest of their lives. And really 503 says, no, that's not good enough. We are looking at you to advance people with disabilities in employment, and I think that's important. So I want to talk about some decision points for job seekers. The first is around disclosure. One thing that's important to know is that disclosure may or may not be a choice for you. If you have an obvious physical disability, you pretty much know going in. Your employer knows going in you have a disability. There's no surprise there. For other people, disability disclosure is a choice, and they have to choose when to disclose that disability. Do you want to do it in your application? Do you want to do it before your interview? Do you want to do it during your interview? Or do you want to wait till after you're hired? And each of these decision points, I think, has different implications, and it's really something that I encourage you to sit down and think about. You know, how do I want to present myself? How am I going to talk about my disability? Those are all things that you should consider. But remember that in order to get an accommodation at work, you have to disclose your disability. If your disability is non-obvious and you decide not to disclose your disability, you are not lying. You are exercising a legally protected choice. And that's something that sometimes employers need to be reminded of. I talked a little bit about how Section 503 was impacting employers' desire to build culture around disability inclusiveness. And it's really a critical aspect, and the research shows that it's really a critical aspect to how people feel in the workplace. So what we know is that how people feel about disclosing their disability isn't predicted by whether or not a person has an obvious or non-obvious disability. It's how am I going to be treated at work after I do this? What's going to happen to me? What's happened to other people? When people see that their company is committed to disability inclusiveness, to building culture around disability, experiences are much more positive. When compliance is the reason that's stated for disability inclusion, team members with disabilities are less likely or have less positive experiences. They're less likely to perceive disability practices as effective. They're more likely to report experiencing problems as a result of requesting an accommodation, and they're less likely to perceive the workplace as inclusive. So it does matter. The company message does matter. And you know, when you're looking at a company that you want to work for, look at their statement. Their can't remember the name of the statement. Look at their diversity statement. Does it include disability? Is it say, you know, gender, nationality, disability? Because that's a really good indication that the company has started to do the work to include people with disabilities. There are some really important factors that go into people's decisions whether or not to disclose a disability. The first is the need for an accommodation. If you don't need, you're not going to ask. Do you have a supportive supervisor relationship? Is your workforce friendly to people with disabilities? Is there active disability recruitment going on? Do we know of other success? So someone else has disclosed their disability and they did not have any less opportunity. They still had opportunities for training and promotion and plum assignments. That's a really critical aspect. When you see someone fail or begin to get coached out because they disclose their disability, then others are not likely to come forward, and it's not safe to come forward. That's a pretty clear indication. Is disability included in the diversity statement, and is there a belief in new opportunities once you disclose that disability? When you're deciding not to disclose your disability, there were also some very important factors. And this is from a study that we did at Cornell University with AAPD and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. We had about 780 people reply to the survey, and they defined kind of what's important and what's not important. So when you were deciding not to disclose, what they said was, if I'm risking being hired or not, if I'm risking being fired or not hired, I'm not going to disclose my disability. If I fear that my employer is going to think too much about my disability and not about what I can do or what I can bring to the job, I will not disclose my disability. If I fear losing my health insurance or my opportunity will be limited, if I don't feel like my supervisor is going to support me after I disclose my disability, I won't disclose. And then there's the risks of being treated differently, of being viewed differently, of being given the less plum assignments because you can't handle the stress. So really, there's a lot of consideration that goes into whether or not someone chooses to disclose. And it's a big decision in a lot of cases. And again, for some of you, it's less of a choice. And I think there are still, though, some important considerations that you have to think about. So another thing that we found in our study was that when employers with disabilities work within departments in which overall employees are supported and they feel fairly treated, they're more likely to feel safe about disclosing their disability. So it's not just disability inclusiveness that matters. It's that inclusive culture that includes, that appreciates diversity and sees what it can bring to the table. So if you're a person who your disability is obvious, that people can see it, or if you're just deciding to disclose your disability early because it's who you are, you want to tell your own story. And I think that's a really critical part of this is you want to put yourself forward in the best light. So you have to think about things like, what do you want to tell people? What do you want people to believe your story is? Focus on what you're good at and what skills you bring to the table and how you're going to enhance their team or enhance the work that they do. How does your disability advantage you in the workplace? Have you found new and creative and innovative ways to do things because of the challenges you face on a daily basis? And what will help you do your job well? So laying out there right now, I work best in this kind of environment. I work best with this kind of equipment. Or in my old job, I had this really successful experience, and here's what it looked like. So that you're saying, this is who I am, this is what I'm good at, this is what I bring to you, and this is how you can help me be my best at this job. So you're kind of framing your own story in the way that you want it told versus letting people make their own decisions. But you have to think about that and think about what it is you want to tell people. And then I want to talk a little bit about accommodations. And I want to tell you a story to do this, so bear with me. Joe just got a job in a warehouse. He is working hard to get to know his colleagues and to fit in with everyone else. He doesn't want to do anything that makes himself stand out, but Joe is struggling. He has rheumatoid arthritis, and working conditions in the warehouse make doing the physical work difficult for him. The swing shifts are especially difficult. He needs some accommodations in order to continue to be effective. He's worried his coworkers will think he wants special treatment. What would Joe do? Now, there are two sides to every story. So we're going to look at the kind of the if he asks and if he doesn't ask kind of sides. If he asks for the accommodation, people will know he's doing something differently. They won't know necessarily why he's doing something differently. Employers can't disclose to your coworkers on your behalf. That is not legal. So they may see that he's not having to work overnights when they are, and they may wonder why that is and why he's getting special treatment. Joe knows that an accommodation will allow him to do his job well, but there's still that risk of the street cred, within the job. Asking for an accommodation prevents conditions from getting worse a lot of times. And they also allow people to continue working. There are real benefits to accommodation. That's why it's included in the law. But you have to balance that with what are the consequences of that request, right, that we talked about earlier. So if he doesn't ask, he won't have to worry about how people will react to him. But likely his performance is going to suffer because he's working in conditions that aren't conducive to supporting a healthy lifestyle for him. And he may lose his job. So you really have to think through, is this going to work for me here? Is this really the best thing for me to do? One thing, just I put this out there for consideration, people with and without disabilities are equally likely to be granted accommodations from their employers. So employers accommodate people all the time. You have a kid, you want to coach the soccer team, you're allowed to flex your schedule. You have a disability, you want to go to the doctor during work hours, you flex your schedule. So you really have to make sure that you're looking at accommodations in the light of what else happens in the workplace. A lot of times, if what you need is flexible scheduling or telecommuting, employers already have those things in place in the workforce. So it may be that you can take advantage of those. It's when your need extends beyond what the employer offers that you have to disclose your disability and ask for an accommodation. Accommodations have very clear benefits in the workplace. So I think if you're worried about how your employer reacts, sharing that information with them, and the Job Accommodation Network has some really great information about the benefits of accommodation. They do a report every year that they update with the benefits that employers have seen about accommodations. But we know, unfortunately, from the research, that the study that we did with the AAPD, about 30% of the respondents in that survey who asked for an accommodation reporting experience one or more of these problems to some extent. Focus on disability over performance. I'm sorry, I can't give you that stressful assignment because I don't know if you can handle it. Those kinds of statements. Treated differently by a supervisor or a coworker, or loss of advancement opportunities. So just make sure you're making the best decision for you. And make sure that you're presenting your need and your story in a way that represents your skill and your desire to do well for your employer. So the next thing I want to talk about a little bit about is medical inquiry. The ADA is very clear in that it prohibits medical inquiry during recruitment, screening, and hiring. Employers can't ask any direct or indirect question about disability while you're applying for a job. Sometimes, though, you get that question, right? And then as a person with a disability in an interview, you're forced with, how do I respond to that? And there are a few ways to do that. And first, let me tell you what a disability inquiry might look like. Does the employer ask if you've had or ever had a disability? How did you become disabled? What is the nature or severity of your disability? That would be a very obvious disability inquiry. Asking an employee's coworker, family members, doctor about the employee's disability. Asking about genetic information. Asking about a prior workers' comp history. So have you ever been on workers' comp? Did you ever have to go on leave? Those kinds of questions. So you just want to make sure that if you're presented with one of the questions that you know how to approach it. And generally what we recommend that people do when they are faced with one of those questions. And it may be something as simple as, we noticed a few breaks in your work history. Did you have a disability during that time? And usually a response that says something like, from that question, I hear you're asking me how I'm going to be effective at that job. And let me tell you how I'll be effective at that job. And kind of just diffuse the situation by redirecting the question into what you bring to the job is a really good way to do that. So we always recommend reframing the question. Now, you can do other things, but it's entirely up to you. Do you educate the employer about the ADA and say, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. That's not legal under the ADA. And also, whether or not you choose to educate the employer, you can file a charge if they ask you an illegal question during the interview with the EEOC. It's really up to you. And you have to do, if you feel like that was the result of you not being offered the job, you should certainly file a charge. But regardless, when you're in the interview, reframe the question into what you bring to the table. tell your story, tell them what you do well. The last thing I want to talk about is some decision points around performance issues. So one of the things we often hear, especially if an employer can see a disability, is, are you going to be able to do the work? Are you going to be able to keep up? And I hear this from people all the time around all kinds of disabilities, and it's extremely frustrating to me. So a lot of times it's employer ignorance. They don't realize that people with disabilities can be held to the same performance standards as others. And that's really to protect you, to say, I'm capable of doing this work. I'm capable of producing just as much as anyone else. I may do it differently, and that's perfectly fine. And so just educating the employer that just because you do something differently doesn't mean that you can't do it or you'll be too slow to do it. So you have to dispel some of those myths. People with disabilities perform as well as any other employee. They don't take up more of a manager's time. They don't have more workplace accidents, and they don't have higher absence rates. This was a study done by DePaul in 2008. And it really proved that some of those myths that people hold around disability just aren't true. So I personally feel that the performance standards are important because people with disabilities are not any less capable than others. It's just that they may approach the job differently. And if reaching those performance standards in the jobs that are pre-existing is difficult for you, customized employment options can really remove some of those performance standards and let your skill and your ability shine in a job that's been defined according to what it is that you need. So there are more than one way to get the job done, right? So I promised earlier in the webinar that I would give you the number for the ADA National Network in the event that you had questions about disability civil rights laws. The ADA, Section 501, Section 503. We get questions on housing and education and pretty much everything because it's a manned technical assistance line. That number is 800-949-4232. And you can also find us on the web at adata.org. So thank you very much for your time and attention. And please do reach out if you do have any questions. Thank you.